Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill C-18, the Online News Act. I do so in response to a bill that has now returned to the House after being in the Senate for quite some time. It was brought to the Senate earlier this year. I believe they started to study it in late January or beginning of February. And then now it arrived at the House as of June 16th and has been considered by this government, and then a motion has been drafted in response to those amendments. To refresh our memories, Bill C-18 is this. It's a bill about supporting local media, so says the minister. And so says the minister, it is also about building a fairer news ecosystem. Now, I'll get to these false claims in just a moment. Now, Bill C-18, it will compel digital platforms such as Google and Facebook to pay when they link to news sources. So not actually providing the entire content of the news source, but just simply providing the link compels Facebook and Google to have to enter into monetary negotiations with the news source. Under this bill, then, those negotiations would take place between the two parties, and there would be no transparency between them in terms of what these negotiations look like and any terms that the platforms might put on these news outlets. That being the case, one has to wonder about the implications for journalistic independence and what this does to true journalism and news coverage in this country. Again, I'll get to that in just a moment, but I would like to highlight that as one of the main issues of this bill. It's also one of the issues that this government had an opportunity to fix. There were amendments that were brought forward by my Conservative colleagues and I here in the House of Commons at committee in order to fix this, and there was an amendment brought forward by a Conservative senator in order to fix this problem as well. And so there was plenty of opportunity. We heard from witness after witness after witness that this bill was a direct threat to journalistic independence. And so it's on that premise that we must begin the discussion today, knowing that this bill actually, therefore, not only fails journalists and news outlets, but it also fails Canadians. Because Canadians deserve access to news that is, in fact, independent of any pressure from a government or any pressure from a platform. Madam Speaker, is there a problem? Okay. I think we have to begin by looking at the importance of media. The Liberals try to paint us as being against media, and they've accused us of being on the side of tech giants. This bill is actually not at all for the media or for the independent journalists that would be proud of their work day in and day out and want to maintain that good work going forward. Now, let me talk about this just a little bit here. So the media plays a few key roles in society that we support. One, they're the watchdog. So in other words, they protect the public interest. So for example, just this year, in the last 6-8 months, we've seen story after story after story come out from the media with regards to this government turning a blind eye to China's interference in our elections. We know, because of a brave whistleblower who came forward, that there was interference both in 2019 and in 2021. We know that the Prime Minister's office was aware of this. We know that the Prime Minister turned a blind eye and chose to do nothing with the CSIS or intelligence reports that were put on his desk or perhaps in his hands. He chose to do nothing. Yet we know, based on his chief of staff testifying at committee, we know that the Prime Minister reads everything, and we know that he is showing everything. So here we are in the House of Commons, and we've had committee meetings with regards to this issue, and we've asked questions with regard to this issue of interference in our elections. And the reason why we've been empowered to do this is because a brave whistleblower came forward who works within CSIS, Canada's foremost intelligence agency, and brought forward the truth. The truth that there were these documents that were produced, that were given to the Prime Minister, and that the Prime Minister turned a blind eye and allowed for Beijing to interfere in our elections because it would benefit the Liberals in the long run. But we know that because of a brave whistleblower using the vehicle of media. So make no mistake, media has an important role to play in our society. Media has an important role to play in terms of telling stories, in terms of raising awareness, in terms of accountability. Media has an important role to play in terms of celebrating incredible things going on in our country and in our local communities. Media has an important role to play in terms of educating folks with regards to various things that are going on. For example, right now, the many wildfires taking place across this country. So we're thankful for the key role that media plays in this country. And the way that media is able to play its greatest role is when it is kept independent, when it is allowed to thrive without government intervention, without undue pressure, without being dictated to. And what Bill C-18 does is it actually puts the government squarely in the middle of the newsroom. So the government determines through this legislation what the CRTC will do. The CRTC then makes decisions, and those decisions are applied to media. According to this bill, the CRTC can compel information from these news businesses, even confidential information. Further to that, through this bill, then there also have to be these negotiations that transpire between the platforms and the news businesses. But we don't know what the terms of those negotiations are. So let's just say that the terms of those negotiations are that as a news business, you get rewarded for the number of clicks. Well, then as a news business, you're motivated to create clickbait. Well, that's not news. At least it's not the type of news that we would expect. It's not the type of news that is most beneficial to Canadian society. So we can see right off the bat that there's this massive problem with this bill. So when the minister says that this bill is about leveling the playing field, it's about creating a more fair news ecosystem, it's about access, well, that's just wrong. Because at the end of the day, yes, we do need media, but we need independent journalists who are going to tell the stories that need to be told without pressure from the government or tech giants. We need journalists to truly be free to come at things from a nonpartisan angle. I wish we had more of that in this country. It would benefit us all. The minister has claimed that the landscape has changed and therefore this bill is needed. I would agree with him in that the landscape indeed has changed. Where I would disagree is that, of course, I don't agree that this bill is in fact the answer. We know that the landscape has changed. We know that fewer people are buying newspapers. We know that fewer people are watching news on television. We know that more and more people are shifting their attention to online. They like to go on a website, or they like to click on a Facebook post, or they like to access it through Twitter. We know that folks prefer to be able to stream in the moment if they're going to watch their news, or many are going to read their news. But we know that they're not necessarily going to read from paper. They're more likely to read from an iPad or a telephone. So yes, the landscape is changing. And as a result of that, because the consumer, the Canadian, is changing his or her habits, it means that more and more traffic is going online. And because more and more traffic has gone online, it means that ads are also being placed online. Which means then that those entities that have been innovative and evolved to that space, those are the entities that are getting the ad dollars. Because of course, when you're advertising, you're going to go to where the people are, and the people are online. But what has happened is that you have these legacy media companies then, whether it's newspapers or broadcasters such as the CBC or Rogers or Bell Media, and they've started to see the shift in terms of their ad revenues. And of course, it's not in their favor. And so as a result, then there's been many concerns that have been expressed to the minister. And so then in response, the minister has come up with Bill C-18. It is in direct response to legacy media. It does not account for the innovative or creative ways of incoming media outlets that are actually thriving in this new tech space. I'd like to read into the record a couple of quotes. This entity was heard from at the Committee on Canadian Heritage here in the House of Commons, and it's by Independent Online News Publishers of Canada, and they said this: any government intervention into the free press, however well-intentioned, must be carefully considered, as there is a potential to warp up outcomes, stifle innovation, determine winners and losers, and compromise journalistic independence. This is a key warning with regard to this legislation and the impact that it is going to have. Further to that, Professor Dwayne Winsick of Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication and the director of Canadian Media Concentration Research Project said this. He said, the media's money troubles are long-standing, and this latest proposal is a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I just think the whole thing is a real dog's breakfast. This bill is being saddled with expectations and being sold as a rescue package. That, I think, is really disingenuous. In other words, as much as we want, or this government might want, this legislation to be the answer to the many problems faced by media, and in particular, revenues dwindling, it's not the answer. The world innovates, the world generates, the world moves forward. And so instead of punishing those individuals who are new and innovative and going to that next place and rewarding legacy media, instead, I believe that it's the government's responsibility to take a step back and to allow the world to evolve, to allow consumer demand to evolve, to allow journalistic independence to maintain itself. Another individual who spoke to this bill at committee was Jen Gerson. She's the co-founder of The Line and independent journalist. And she said this about this bill. She said, this bill is predicated on a lie. The bill adopts a very ancient complaint of newspaper publishers that aggregation-based news websites and social media networks are unduly profiting by publishing our content. But of course, we know this isn't true. In fact, the value proposition runs in exactly the opposite direction. We publishers are the ones who benefit when a user posts a link to our content on Facebook, Twitter, and alike. This free distribution drives traffic to our website, which we can then try to monetize through subscriptions and advertising. So clearly stated. So you have these entities online, and they can be connected to through platforms, posting links. In other words, it's propagating or propelling free traffic. It's doing the advertising for these news sources. And so this individual, Jen Gerson, is calling it for what it is. She's actually saying, wait a second, actually the sharing of our links is actually a good thing. That's what drives people to our sites and gives us the opportunity to make money. This legislation is built on a wrong foundation. It's built on the foundation that somehow that these platforms shouldn't be sharing these news links, that they should be punished by having to pay a financial penalty for sharing these news links. Well, that just doesn't make any sense. The way that information flows online is when links are shared. So if you want the news to be read, if you want the source to be accessed, then allow for the links to be shared. And if you allow for the links to be shared, then of course it drives more traffic. And if it drives more traffic, then of course you have more people viewing the content. And if you have more people viewing the content, then you have more people that are wanting to advertise with you. So what she's saying is that really the government has this bill all wrong. Let's get into some of the nitty-gritty of the bill. There are many serious concerns that were raised at committee, both in the Senate and here in the House of Commons, with regards to where the benefit lies. So government officials said that this is going to generate about $215 million for various news sources across Canada. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, an independent entity, said that this bill is going to generate about $350 million. So what's going to happen with that money? Well, here's what the Parliamentary Budget Officer said. He said this: it was reported that 75% of the money will go to the CBC, to Rogers, and to Bell, which leaves less than 25% for newspapers. Madam Speaker, this entire bill has been put forward by this minister saying that it's to protect local newspapers. That's not true. This bill will not help local newspapers the way that he has said it will. This bill will not help ethnic media sources. This bill will not help digital media sources. This bill looks to the past. It does not look to the future. And so this bill is incredibly problematic. So while you have the CBC, you have Rogers, and you have Bell that are accepting 75% of the revenue, you have local newspapers in cities like Lethbridge, or towns like Picture Butte, or Coaldale, or Colehurst in my riding, and they're not going to get a dime from this legislation. So this minister continues to be incredibly disingenuine in how he touts this legislation, saying that it's going to benefit these small newspapers, when in fact this legislation was built or designed solely in favor of legacy broadcasters. Further to that, this bill gives a tremendous amount of control to the CRTC. And so the CRTC now will be responsible for determining if a news outlet is truly a news outlet. And how will they define this? Well, we know somewhat. We don't know entirely, but we know somewhat. We know that somewhat of that definition will be based on whether or not the entity has a license with the CRTC. Now, that's interesting to me because just because you have a license with the CRTC doesn't mean you produce news. Which begs the question then, where is the money going? Is it truly going to local news? Is it truly going to ethnic media? Is it truly going to digital sources? Is it truly going toward the future of news in our country? And the answer to that question we already know, and that is no. Further to that, the CRTC will not only determine if you're an eligible news business, but the CRTC will also determine some of the negotiating factors. There's some independence for you. In fact, the CRTC can compel these news businesses to give up information, including confidential information. Here's what a few people had to say about this. Bill C-18 will only perpetuate a market already distorted by subsidy and will punish independence. If Parliament values a free press, it will not approve Bill C-18. Who said that? Peter Menzies, former CRTC commissioner. Peter Menzies followed that up by saying this. He said, Bill C-18 is as likely to kill journalism in Canada as it is to save it. The very prospect of it is already perverting news coverage and undermining trust. Trust. The commodity upon which the industry most depends. Bill C-18 will permanently entrench the industry's dependency not on the loyalty of citizens, readers, and viewers, but upon the good graces of politicians and the ability of offshore quasi-monopoly tech companies to remain profitable. Could there be a more damning statement? Madam Madam Speaker, if we truly value the independence of our press, if we truly value the future of our country, if we truly value having access to real news, everyone in this House should vote against this bill in a unified manner. Here's another quote from Dr. Michael Geist, who's at the University of Ottawa, who specializes in this. He said, Bill C-18 doesn't only increase the power of the internet companies, it also provides exceptional new powers to the CRTC. These include determining which entities qualify as news businesses, which agreements create an exemption, which Canadian news organizations qualify, and whether the arbitration decisions should be approved. On top of that, the CRTC will also create a code of conduct, implement the code, and wield penalty powers for failure to comply. Far from a hands-off approach, the CRTC will instantly become the most powerful market regulator of the news sector in Canada. Again, Madam Speaker, this bill fails to protect the independence of the press. And when it fails to protect the independence of the press, it then fails Canadians as a whole, because Canadians depend on being able to access news that is not a result of pressure from tech companies or pressure from the government. So when this government points fingers and says Conservatives are in the pocket of the tech giants, no, Madam Speaker, actually they are. They are squarely in the pocket of the tech giants, because they created legislation that directly benefits those tech giants, because those tech giants get to give direction to these news outlets as to what to produce and what not to produce. So it's this government that took power and gave it all over to the tech giants. Make no mistake of that. Let's talk a little bit about this bill and whether or not it actually supports local newspapers. I've already said in my writing there's hardly a dime to be gained. But mine's not the only one. We know that many local newspapers across this country are struggling right now, and we know that many of them are dependent on only one journalist. And because of that, they will not be able to apply for this. They will not get the CRTC's stamp of approval as an allowable news outlet. And so, Madam Speaker, this bill will put them under. This bill has nothing in store for their future. In fact, this bill will result in their demise, because this bill will raise up legacy media and big broadcasters and therefore put them in a favorable position while simultaneously pushing down those local newspaper outlets that exist in ridings like mine. So shame on this government for trying to mislead Canadians. Shame. And I should mention, it is not just that this bill will support the big Canadian broadcasters or the big Canadian newspapers, but I should also mention that this bill is so broad that it actually expands to foreign news outlets such as the New York Times. And I should also mention that it will expand to hundreds of broadcasters that are licensed by the CRTC, again, whether or not they produce media, or I should say news. So the question is then, is this bill actually doing what this government says that it is? And the answer is no. This bill will not revive the media. This bill will not save local entities. This bill is not the solution. In fact, I would argue that this bill actually is the problem. It perpetuates the problem. It personifies the problem. It embodies the problem. It is synonymous with the problem. Let me read another quote here from Andrew Coyne. He's a columnist in the Globe and Mail. It took a lot of courage for him to provide this, but nevertheless, it's an important one. He says, the premise that the problems of the newspaper industry can be traced to search and social media platforms like Google or Facebook stealing their content is utterly false. The platforms don't take our content, they link to it. A headline, sometimes a short snippet of text, nothing more. When users click on the links, they are taken to our sites where they read our content. Much of the traffic on our sites, in fact, comes from social media links, which is why we go to such lengths to encourage readers to post them. Indeed, we post such links ourselves, hundreds of them a day. Again, make no mistake, when platforms post links to news, it is of great benefit to the National Posts of the world, the Globe and Mails of the world, and so on and so forth. That is what Andrew Coyne is getting at here. It is of great benefit to have these links posted. Here's the problem, though, Madam Speaker. Because of this legislation, Facebook has already said that they will no longer be carrying news links. And Google has indicated that they are considering doing the same, which means that these links would no longer be made available to Canadians. Not on Meta or Facebook, Instagram, and not on Google. If that's the case, this bill kills newspapers, because Canadians will no longer have those links available to them within the framework of a Google search or within the framework of Facebook or Instagram. And that's a problem, because as I just read into the record, Andrew Coyne makes it very clear that the entire model is dependent on those links being made available. In fact, the news outlets themselves post those links. In fact, he says they don't just post them once or twice, they post them hundreds of times per day. So this government forcing this legislation upon Facebook and Google, therefore them making a business decision to retract and not carry news links anymore, is actually going to kill newspapers. But this government doesn't care. They'd prefer that you didn't know that. Because at the end of the day, this legislation, though touted as something that benefits newspapers, is actually built to benefit CBC, Rogers, and Bell Media. We know that. So the government has built this piece of legislation on a lie. But it sounds nice. It sounds like they're for local media. It sounds like they're for ethnic media. It sounds like they're for progress. They like that word, progress.
Like everything.
When in fact this bill is one of the most regressive pieces of legislation that I have ever seen. And it is one that will put a spear directly through the heart of newspapers. And eventually, other outlets will dwindle too. So let's make no mistake. Let's talk about this legislation for what it truly is. Let's talk about the fact that the CBC has the greatest amount to benefit from this legislation. And let's talk about the fact that the CBC is already funded to the tune of about $1.2 billion per year by taxpayer dollars. And let's talk about the fact that this legislation then will allow the CBC to enter into negotiations with platforms and therefore gain more money. And let's talk about the fact that this actually benefits the CBC to a massive extent. So they'll get money from the government, they'll get money from their negotiations with Google and Facebook, and they'll get money through ad revenues. Guess who doesn't have the benefit of all of those sources of income? Local newspapers. Guess who else? Ethnic newspapers. Guess who else? Innovative, creative news startups. So make no mistake, this bill is not about supporting the future of news. This bill is not about supporting newspapers. This bill is all about supporting legacy media. It is all about the CBC, primarily. And secondly, it is about Bell Media and Rogers. That is what this bill is about. So if the government wants to present this bill under a true premise, I'd be more than happy to debate it under that premise. But the one that it's been put forward today is altogether false, and it's incredibly misleading. It should also be considered that this bill does likely violate our agreements with the United States of America. And that has been brought up. Ms. Catherine Tay of the United States Trade Representative has warned that Bill C-18 has serious trade implications for Canada. And we have been warned that if we move forward with this legislation, they are likely to retaliate. And if they retaliate, that will be to the tune of about $350 million. So what that does then is that means that this government is choosing that they are going to benefit legacy media at the expense of small and medium-sized businesses in our country that are going to be subject to that punitive response by the United States. And this government shrugs its shoulder because it doesn't care. So it's going to pass a bad piece of legislation that is going to result in newspapers dying, ethnic media dying, and new startups not gaining a dime of support. And then on top of that, it's also going to result in punitive outcomes for our small and medium-sized businesses that are going to have trade barriers or penalties put against them. So at the end of this day, this bill is a lose, lose, lose. There is nothing here to be gained. If the government wanted to give the CBC more money, they could have just cut a check. They do it all the time. But here's the biggest thing. The biggest thing is this. The biggest thing is that Canadians lose. Canadians lose because they want access to a variety of media. And unfortunately, that's going to be depleted. Canadians lose because they want access to independent media. They want to be able to trust the journalists that are bringing forward the stories that they so long to hear. But this bill doesn't protect journalistic independence. Furthermore, Canadians lose out because right now they enjoy the convenience of being able to go online and find links to news. And this bill will result in those links largely being removed. So at the end of the day, this bill is a direct attack on Canadians and their ability, and I would even say their right, to access the information that they depend on as timely news in this country. And there is no one else to blame for that shift, that change, that damaging effect than this government. They had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, whether it was here in debate, whether it was hearing from witnesses at committee, whether it was amendments that were brought forward by myself or my colleagues, or whether it was Senate amendments that were made. This government has had plenty of opportunity to correct this bill. And every step of the way, they've chosen not to. And that's their shame. But sadly, it is also the shame of Canadians, because ultimately they are the ones that are punished by this bill. That said, Madam Speaker, because this bill is so damaging to Canadians and their ability to access news from independent sources and a plethora of sources and in a convenient and timely manner, I move a motion. I move this, that the motion be amended by deleting all of the words after the first word "that" and substituting the following. The order for the consideration of the amendments made by the Senate to Bill C-18, an act respecting online communications platforms that make news content available to persons in Canada, be discharged and the bill withdrawn. And this is seconded by my colleague, the MP for Lakeland. Thank you.